Thank you very much for joining us. I see we are around 50 participants already, so thank you for joining us in such a great number at this very early hour in the Americas and very late in Asia Pacific. And also with many other very interesting events at the same time in parallel to this 2020 high-level political forum on sustainable development. So we have only one little hour, even if we might go slightly over. And so I really encourage everyone to go to the respective websites and social media of the organizers, to access more information, including the concept note and the full bios of our speakers, as I will have to be quite minimalistic in my moderation because of the time. I think my colleague Thomas will send in the Q&A a link to where you can access these documents. At the outset, maybe two technical announcements. So first, this event is recorded. And we would wish to make it available, the video afterwards on our websites. So just be aware of this. Secondly, very important for our participants, you can ask your questions and post your comments in the Q&A thread. So you have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can use it to post your comments and questions. And our excellent panel and I will try to pick and answer as many as possible during this conversation. So my name is Sandra Epalration, and I'm the Advocacy Director of Franciscans International, and on behalf of Franciscans International, my organization, but also on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Center for Economic and Social Rights, CSR, it's really a big pleasure to welcome you all on this discussion on walking the talk, exploring concrete steps towards human rights aligned policies in a world in crisis. So why this event? Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously there had been strong calls, including a very prominent one by the UN Secretary General himself, to concretely link human rights to the Agenda 2030. And some initiatives in this direction are already happening, as we will hear in a couple of minutes by our first eminent speaker, His Excellency Ambassador Frank Tressler, Permanent Representative of Chile to the UN in Geneva. But before giving you the floor, Mr. Ambassador, let me just say that today this call of the Secretary General is more relevant than ever. And indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has acted as a magnifying glass on structural human rights deprivations and the systematic failure to prioritize the rights of people, to combat economic and social inequalities, and to take urgent and bold actions for our planet and our climate. And so beyond this broad acknowledgement that we hear a lot of the inseparable nature of Agenda 2030 and human rights in the discourse, we wish today to discuss and explore the opportunities and obstacles for concrete and actionable human rights aligned policies based on specific country experiences. That's our hope. And for these experiences, we look very much forward to after the opening remarks by Ambassador Tressler, to listening to Busisi Beko from the Institute for Economic Justice in South Africa, and from Mrs. Savi Bisnat, who is Senior Economist at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So again, a very warm welcome to you both. And last but not least, we are also very privileged to have Mr. Olivier de Schutter, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Extreme Poverty, and Mrs. Kate Donald, my colleague from CSR, as discussants today with us. And they will help us and me all through the discussion to explore the challenges governments are facing in ensuring that policies can fulfill both the political commitments under the Agenda 2030, but also the legal obligations under international human rights law. And maybe also the challenges and opportunities for civil society organizations to bring human rights into the design and the implementation of sustainable development measures, but also now the pandemic response policies and the recovery packages at the international and national levels. And also they will help to answer again as many questions or feature in as many questions and comments as possible that we will get from our participants in the Q&A. But now, without further ado, I give the floor with pleasure and honor to you, Excellency, for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and good morning if you are in the Americas on that side of the world, and good afternoon to the people here in this side of the world. I'm very honored and pleased for this opportunity to give the opening remarks for these side events, Walking the Talk, exploring concrete steps towards human rights aligned policies in a world in crisis. I like, and may I say, I like the concept to walk the talk, to bring ideas down to earth by explaining how multilateral discussions and instruments apply to everyday lives. And perhaps the current circumstances give us an opportunity to rethink a more effective human rights-based approach to our policy implementation in a world shocked by COVID-19, where we see the exposed fragility of many social and economic systems, as well as human rights shortages and deprivations. A world with less resources and more concerns might have an effect on the implementation of development policies, including our national objectives of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And because of that, it is important not to lose our sight. The 2030 Agenda gives us a roadmap to eradicate poverty and to improve the quality of people's lives, and remains valid whatever circumstances are, to leave no one behind. And as the Secretary General of United Nations mentions on his call to action for human rights, the SDGs echoes the spirit of our human rights commitment as, and I quote, they not only imagine a world in which the material condition exists for people to attain their rights, but also a world in which peoples are empowered to participate actively in decisions that affect them. End the quote. That perspective has been promoted by a group of friends on human rights and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in Geneva, composed by Chile, Denmark, Ecuador, Luxembourg, Portugal, Rwanda, and Uruguay. The group later expanded since March 2017 to include Thailand, Sierra Leone, Azerbaijan, and Fiji. Our aim is to facilitate a practical and inclusive conversation to be followed by action about the optimal role of the human rights pillar in making the best possible contributions for the fulfillment of the 2030 Agenda. I'm happy to comment that just a couple of weeks ago, the Human Rights Council adopted by consensus the Resolution 4319 on the promotion and protection of human rights and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is the second resolution on the subject, the previous one being Resolution 3724 from 2018. This resolution allows us to keep exploring how human rights standards and the lessons learned can inform and guide SDGs implementations, always following the themes and priorities of the high-level political forum. I had the fortune to chair the second intersessional meeting on human rights and the SDGs last December, which revolve around human rights and accelerate actions and transformative pathways to realize the decade of action and delivery for sustainable development. That meeting focused on three main areas of work. First, the measures to promote empowerment, inclusion, and equality in the implementation of the SDGs, highlighting the impact of climate change, eradicating poverty, achieving gender equality, and building peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. Second, the role of the human rights mechanism in supporting the achievement of SDGs goals and targets, as well as the experiences and good practices of establishing and strengthening human rights national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up. The third pillar, the importance of ensuring adequate space for civil society, business representatives, and other stakeholders. Some of the key messages on those discussions were the need of strong leadership, political will, and financial resources for this decade of action and delivery by 2030. The transformative nature of the 2030 Agenda required people to put first and human rights-based public policies to be adopted, including stronger social protections and pro-poor macroeconomic policies. Growing inequalities demonstrate the need for a special focus on countries and groups of people that were being left behind. Additional challenges impeding implementations of the SDGs, including conflict and insecurity. it was stressed the need for greater attention to the imperative of human rights focused prevention and conflict resolution, and the crucial role of national statistic offices in supporting implementation of the SDGs to adopt a human rights-based approach to data collection and analysis. Let me illustrate some of these points with concrete examples. Albania, for example, during that session, explained how they track the recommendation received during their universal peer review with a web-based platform which allows civil society, press, parliament, and others to view what had been made and the status of the response to them, and how that instrument could be easily linked to follow up governmental objectives for SDGs implementation. We also learned, for example, how Costa Rica considered human rights approaches to implement the goals in its national planning instrument, especially in the fight against poverty, on sustainable production, and on sustainable communities as entry points. Kenya gave an overview of the collaboration between the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights and the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics with the support of the Office of the High Commissioner to identify 29 population groups, including persons with disabilities, lesbians, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons, and indigenous groups, to focus the information gathering in the national census. The data was used to develop a framework for enhanced monitoring of Sustainable Development Goal 16 to promote peaceful and sustainable societies. In Chile, we have established an interministerial committee to ensure implementation of the goals at all levels and in every sector, considering factors such as representativeness, with decentralization, transparency, and relevance to make it an inclusive process. All these examples stress how human rights mechanisms can inform the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, empower people, and adopt approaches that help to bring the benefits of the SDGs, all factors that become more relevant as we look how to recover our stride from the impacts of the current COVID-19 pandemic. But it is important not to forget that the consequences of the current COVID pandemic will be felt hard in our societies this and next year. People that were lifted above the poverty line will sadly fall back. We will see the increase of unemployment and most probably shifts on the aims of public policies in order to regain social and economic growth. That is a reality that we must face and probably will make more difficult our path towards the goals of 2030s. Taking that in consideration also could help us to use it as an opportunity to build public policies more inclusive. As we say in Spanish, when a door closes, a window opens. So we must ensure that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for these words and for also keeping the time so that we can have some discussions, especially some reactions by other panelists. I think it was very important that you described the efforts, including led by Chile and Denmark in Geneva to ensure these bridges between New York and Geneva with this new resolution that you mentioned that was just adopted to continue this work, but also that you reflected on what happened at the last intersessional meeting that really put shed some light on the need to mobilize financial resources to strengthen social protection. I think these are themes that will probably resonate with our two discussants and the other panelists, of course, but I think, as I said, at this stage, I want to be a more technical chair, so I would like to not to say too much and to see if Olivier de Scutter and Kate would like at this stage to give a very short comment or questions, or if we just go to our two next speakers. Just feel free, Olivier and Kate, to raise your hand if you wish to intervene at this stage. Olivier? Yes, please.
Thank you, Sandra, and many thanks to Your Excellency, Ambassador Tressler, for this very stimulating set of opening remarks. I love this Spanish proverb, when a door closes, a window opens. I simply would like to add that this is a once in a generation opportunity we have to steer the economy in the right direction. overall, it is estimated that some 11 trillion US dollars have been injected in various economic recovery plans across the world by governments. And this is a huge amount of money, particularly in OECD countries. On average, 5% of the GDP of rich countries have been injected by governments in the economy for the recovery. It's a much smaller percentage that developing countries can inject in the economy, but still it will steer the direction of progress for the next 10, 15 years. And I think the challenge today is really not only to bridge human rights objectives and sustainable development, but also to have both a pro-poor and a pro-climate approach to economic recovery. And I look forward to our discussion, because I think it is this equation we need to keep in mind. It's not having to choose between social justice, the reduction of poverty, the reduction of inequalities on the one hand, or the greening of the economy on the other hand. It's combining the two together. And I look forward to our discussion. I simply would like to say that this is exactly the theme of my next report to the General Assembly, to the 75th session, on the idea of the just transition. So I'll be carefully looking forward to the remarks of Busi Sibeko and Savi Bithnat to provide some suggestions in this regard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Olivier, for that. And as a matter of fact, we will go now to our next two speakers who will give even more of this country experience. Ambassador Tressler already started to mention, Secretary General called, he was calling for actions to ensure that human rights principles inform policy making, especially in the area of economy and finance, as a matter of fact. And I think this is very much something that our two speakers will be able to share with us now. And I think we'll start with Busi Sibeko from South Africa, and your experience with working on budget and economic and financial policies in your national context. So Busi, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to also put on my timer so that I also respect the 8 minutes. But just wanted to start by kind of giving an overview of where we've come from. On the 23rd of March in South Africa, the president announced a lockdown, a complete lockdown that would only see essential workers being able to go to and from work. It was initially meant to be 3 weeks, but it was extended to 5 weeks, and now it has been extended at varying levels indefinitely. Prior to lockdown, we know that South Africa was already in a dire position, and that we were probably not going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We know that in South Africa, prior to the lockdown, there was stagnating growth. We had already entered into a recession. There's high unemployment, with 39% of people unemployed if you take into account the expanded definition. Most of these people are Black women, and we know that Black children in particular in South Africa are the most vulnerable to poverty. With the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown of the country, its businesses, many more jobs were in jeopardy. Companies are going under, and millions of people face an uncertain future. This is, of course, an unprecedented time in our economy. But we also know that before lockdown, at least 55% of South Africa's population lived below the poverty line of 1,267 Rand per month. And so as lockdown began, we were all concerned about what would happen to these people who were very vulnerable. A month later, the president announced a 500 billion relief package, which would equate to 10% of GDP. We were not quite excited, if I can put it mildly, about the package itself, as, for instance, only 10% of it was composed of social grants that would be given to people. We were, of course, happy that this would include a new grant for those who are unemployed, a new social relief grant, which we had never had before. While we weren't quite happy about the number itself, but it was a new step in South Africa that had not happened before. With such high levels of unemployment, we were obviously always worried about this. There was money allocated to help municipalities to be able to provision water and sanitation. And of course, in South Africa, we'd anticipate that at this point in time that many people would already have access. But what COVID did was to demonstrate the true need of the scale. For instance, we knew that 2,433 schools do not have access to potable water, even though it is 2020. The package also included wage guarantees and loan guarantees for businesses. It also included tax relief, and also included, of course, health expenditure and job protection and creation. Our initial assessment of this package was that it was inadequate, even though it seemed extensive. We were worried that even with this package, 2 million more people would be below the poverty line during the lockdown. We're concerned that many more people, particularly those who are non-South African nationals, would be going hungry during this lockdown. Due to the closure of schools, the nutrition programs were also closed down, which means children who normally access food at school were not able to access this food. And we also argued that this package, particularly the social relief grants, were punitive to women, because if you were a woman who was registered as a caregiver, you were automatically not eligible for the social relief grant, which was targeted at the unemployed. And therefore, in general, it seemed that the social relief grant component of it was really set on exclusionary terms, which disproportionately would affect women and were therefore discriminatory. 100 days after lockdown, we finally saw the supplementary budget that was meant to help realize this 500 billion package. To say that we're disappointed is really an understatement. First of all, what we saw in this budget was that there was a serious failure to implement even the proposals that had been put forward. The budget was full of smoke and mirrors, and everywhere that money was being reallocated to for COVID response, it was being taken away from where we desperately needed it. The new money that was being proposed to the budget was only 43 billion, and excluding this debt servicing costs, it would only be 36 billion, which equated to only 1% of GDP, although we had been promised a large 10% stimulus. Most of all, this budget also proposed further austerity measures. And I'll come back to this because the United Nations Committee had already said that they were concerned about South Africa's austerity measures as of 2018. But what we saw in this budget is that our government is set on cutting more of the budget and attempting to reach a surplus by 2023, which would mean massive cuts to a lot of expenditure. And it had really failed to go hard, go early, and go to households. But I think what was also very disappointing is that the president had gone to great lengths to discuss the second pandemic that we're experiencing in our country, which is gender-based violence. And this budget makes no mention of gender-based violence at all, despite all the talk action that had been happening around this. But it's very important to note that South Africa's fiscal policy is meant to reflect the constitutional framework which this country has entrenched. And that, in fact, the South African Constitution is the supreme law, and in some ways actually goes beyond what the United Nations Covenant actually covers. And some of these rights that are written in this Constitution, some can be realized immediately, whereas others can be realized progressively. But what we have seen during this period is that human rights have not been centered in the economic policy making process that has come into the fore. In fact, we know that the failure to implement and the failure to protect human rights now will have larger implications, including not being able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So where we are now is that civil society in South Africa is considering taking this up, taking this to court to challenge the government, because this has been a gross violation of human rights, and this budget does not seek to progressively realize these rights or immediately realize these rights. We have not fixed our fiscal stance despite the UN committee stating that we needed to review our fiscal policy in order to improve its capacity to mobilize the domestic resources required to bridge existing gaps and to increase its redistributive effect. Since 2018, South Africa has not done this. And in fact, the trends that we saw in 2018 have continued of austerity, whereby cuts have been implemented in terms of per capita expenditure in health, in education, and therefore it's no surprise that we find ourselves here. Despite these cuts to education, the current budget also proposes further net cuts to the education budget, despite schools having to open and to accommodate the COVID response. So just to conclude, I think that while there were some positive kind of elements that we thought would come from this 500 billion that was announced, we did not see all of them materialize. And in fact, we are very deeply concerned about where South Africa is. I am deeply concerned about where South Africa is and expect that we will not reach the Sustainable Development Goals without a consideration of gender in particular in our country. And as we know, the average South African is a young Black poor woman. As long as we don't consider the needs that needed to be met, not today, but yesterday. And we are here because of the failure and continuous failure to deliver, to provide service delivery and to realize human rights continuously. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Lucy, for that. And I won't even try to summarize or comment. It was very, very clear. And I think it's time for me to turn to, again, maybe Olivier and Kate, in case you want to make a quick comment at this point. No? So with that, if there is no comment from that, I just want to remind people, the participants, that you should not hesitate to post your questions and comments if you wish to, even while people are speaking, because then we can embed them in the discussion or in responses. You can also post them later after the interventions, but don't hesitate to use the Q&A thread and function. And with that, I will give the floor immediately to Savvy Bisnath. So as I said, you're a senior economist. You joined the Office of the High Commissioner to work on an initiative, the Surge Initiative, and exactly dedicated to what we are discussing, to try to apply human rights very concretely to economic policies, if I understand correctly. So, but more from you directly, Savvy. So you have the floor for 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Ambassador Tressler, Special Rapporteur, Distributor, colleagues and friends, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Many thanks to the Franciscans International and the Center for Economic and Social Rights for co-sponsoring this important discussion and the invitation to participate alongside my esteemed colleagues. OHCHR's emerging work on issues related to the economy has been long and pioneering. We have promoted the indivisibility of rights, especially highlighting that violations of civil and political rights are often triggered by retrogression in economic and social rights. Our High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, a former head of state herself, supports OHCHR's deepening role in policy discussions with UN country teams in the areas of economic, social, cultural rights, the SDGs, and COVID-19 and recovery efforts. In fact, under her leadership, a new initiative was created to specifically focus on economic, social, cultural rights and the SDGs, which Sandra referred to, the Surge Initiative. It's important to note that Chile has been at the forefront of integrating human rights into the SDG framework. Most recently, as the ambassador noted, Chile chaired the December 2019 intersessional meeting on the Human Rights Council on Human Rights and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. OHCHR has been instrumental in developing human rights obligations and principles related to ESCR. The principles of non-discrimination, transparency, accountability, and participation are of particular relevance for economic approaches that center human rights. We've been particularly engaged with the minimum core obligations, as the international community and governments have been focused on keeping people and countries afloat. UN human rights system, including the special procedures and the treaty bodies, have offered a wealth of recommendations on how to anchor human rights into more inclusive and sustainable economies and curb inequalities. The relevance and urgency of those recommendations are even more visible in the context of COVID-19, which many of the speakers have said before. COVID-19 is more than a health crisis. It's an economic crisis, and it's also a human rights crisis. A key challenge is shrinking fiscal space, which the ambassador alluded to, in low and middle income countries, which hampers the fulfillment of the minimum core obligations. National economies are faced with external shocks, and revenue generation in many countries have shrunk due to decreases in trade, foreign direct investments, and remittances. Over the last 40 years, structural adjustment, austerity, and orthodox economic policies have weakened the capacities of the state to deliver on universal social services. These policy choices have had the predictable effect of concentrating gains at the top, while forcing the rest of society to shoulder the burden. We are witnessing poverty, increased poverty and inequality, with individuals and communities who experience persistent discrimination and marginalization, including workers in the informal sector, significantly affected by the loss of jobs and income, with little or no savings and a lack of social protections. The pandemic has revealed systemic inequalities within countries. As the High Commissioner noted, and I quote, "Wherever they exist, disaggregated data indicate that members of racial and ethnic minorities and indigenous peoples are both more likely to die of COVID-19 and are hit the hardest by its socio-economic consequences," end quote. We also know that women and girls, as Lucy said, within the context of the care economy have had their workload increase. And because of discrimination in the labor market, women are often paid less, while many are in informal jobs that are precarious and lack social protection. As a result, female-headed households have little to no savings with which to navigate this crisis. Within this context, OHCHR has been actively engaged in the UN socio-economic impact assessments at the country level. We've been assessing the ways in which specific communities are impacted by the crisis, including women working in the informal services sector and migrants, advising on and analyzing the extent to which stimulus packages are addressing pre-existing inequalities and cater for marginalized communities, working with national human rights institutions and civil society to build disaggregated data sets that enable focus on groups left behind, and stepping up analysis and advice on placing human rights commitments at the center of recovery efforts. Given fiscal constraints at the national level, the United Nations is calling for a large-scale, coordinated, and comprehensive relief package, at least 10% of the global economy. High-income countries can manage this with their own resources, but low and middle-income countries need massive and urgent support. Approximately 102 countries have requested emergency financing from the IMF. Many low and middle-income countries are concerned that the financing is not enough, and debt service payments will further deplete resources needed to respond to this crisis. For instance, in the first quarter of this year, Nigeria spent 99% of its revenue on servicing its debt. The Secretary General recently co-chaired a meeting on the debt and has noted that alleviating crushing debt is absolutely crucial. The UN is calling for an across-the-board debt standstill for countries unable to service their debt, targeted debt relief, and a comprehensive approach to structural issues in the international debt architecture to prevent defaults, and welcomes the steps taken by the G20. What do human rights aligned policies look like in the context of COVID, and how do we build back better? The specifics must be adapted for each country, yet we know what we need to do. Strengthen the role and responsibilities of the state to secure freedom from fear and want without discrimination. ensure functioning, fair, and progressive tax systems that generates the resources to deliver, support and encourage states to comply with their minimum core obligations when loans, especially when loans and grants are given by the international financial institutions, provide universal social protection and health coverage, protect labor rights, secure the right to education for all, end all forms of discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization, and enable participation, voice, and representation of all people and all countries in the decisions that affect people's lives. In addition to centering people and prioritizing fiscal space alongside civic space, recovery needs to go hand in hand with climate action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Savi, as well, for your remarks. And I think it is good to go into some more discussions as the first questions are coming to the Q&A, but also possible responses, especially by Olivier and Kate. I just noted from your intervention, I like when economists are talking about changes in economic models. So it's very good to hear that again from you, in a very powerful manner. But also, as you said, it's always interesting to be reminded that the human rights system, the UN human rights system, and in particular treaty bodies, that was said by Bouzy, by you, and I guess it will resonate with Olivier's experience on the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights before this new mandate, that this system is also producing very concrete recommendations, as we saw also for South Africa, that would maybe just need to be implemented to make things maybe better, even in a context of crisis where obviously we all know resources will be limited and the obstacles are of course important, but also the role of the Office of the High Commissioner in trying to make human rights really operational in socio-economic policies at national level, but also, as you said, encouraging a more conducive or at least human rights protective multilateral environment through different measures and response funds, or at least encouragement to states. With this wrap-up words, I turn to Olivier and Kate, but also I don't know if the two of you and the other speakers you saw, we have three quite interesting questions that came in. One is about although the person, Brian Bond, who is asking the question said it's hopelessly idealistic, but could we ask state to consider some kind of moratorium on military spending to make it up for the resources we need for human rights implementation, which I think it's a fair question to pose. We also have a question to you, Olivier, directly on from Cynthia Matthew on just transition. If you can say maybe a bit more on how you conceive it. And also an interesting question from Mona Sabera from ESCRnet on to Bouzy on maybe the role, if you know that, the role of possible corporations to attempt to influence the stimulus package in South Africa. I'm cutting it a bit short, or I'm summarizing it, and then we have another I think that's it in terms of questions, and we just have Nate Coleman who is giving us a link that we will make available to everyone, an interesting analysis of the situation in South Africa. So with that, maybe Kate, you haven't spoken yet. Do you want to go first, or Olivier?
Sure, I can go. Thanks so much to Bouzy and Savi for such a good overview of what's happening first, kind of at the national level in South Africa, and then Savi, the kind of global trends that we're seeing. And I think both of your interventions for me really, really hone in on what has been the great failing of the Sdg era so far. And that's really that we've seen very little attempt to grapple with the fact that to achieve the SDGs, we need to profoundly reshape our economies. Instead, we're seeing many states and even some UN agencies, I have to say, not the Office of the High Commissioner, kind of colluding in the fiction that the SDGs can be achieved with business as usual, with a kind of spot of economic growth here, an anti-poverty program there, and throw in some voluntary initiatives from the private sector, and there you go. But really, the experience of this pandemic especially has shown us, I mean, it was already clear that that wasn't going to get us there, but the experience of this pandemic has really, really starkly illustrated the deficiencies of that model. And I think, in terms of the silver lining of the pandemic, I think, it's taken this pandemic to really upend many of these economic orthodoxies by exposing the myths and inequities which our economies were built on. But I think, as Busi illustrates from the South African context, the vast stimulus packages that we're seeing from many governments, at least, in many high-income countries and some middle-income countries, to respond to the pandemic are kind of like emergency surgery, when what really was needed was a preventative approach. This is the kind of scale and level of social spending that should have been taking place already to realize human rights and to meet the SDGs. But the problem is, as BC very well illustrated, that the spending isn't necessarily being directed to the right places, and the money isn't necessarily being raised from the right people in the right places. And I'll wrap up in a minute and I can come in again later, but I think I just want to say as well, for me, it's super exciting that this event that is focused on the SDGs and human rights has such a strong focus on economic policy and economic models, because I think a lot of people that I've spoke to in my experience of doing advocacy around the SDGs and human rights, when I say, oh, I work on human rights and the SDGs, people immediately think of goal 16. They think of that as the human rights goal. And of course, goal 16 is a human rights goal. It's extremely important. Goal 16 is the goal that includes kind of peace and good governance and fundamental civil and political freedoms. But, of course, human rights is much, much broader than that. Economic and social rights are equally human rights as civil and political rights, and actually give us a very good roadmap, I think, to implement the SDGs. And hopefully we can talk about that a bit more in the conversation. Thanks.
So Olivier now, and we have a couple of more questions that came in. I don't know if you could see them, Olivier. Yeah, also from Aoife Nolan on the guidelines on human rights impact assessment of economic policy reforms and how they can be used. I'm missing one, but if you can see it from Lucy as well, Lucy McCannon from the GI. So Olivier, I leave the floor.
Thank you. And let me perhaps summarize the three challenges that you are facing and that these interventions we just heard serve to highlight. The first challenge, it seems to me, is that we do not have yet, from the human rights framework, a solid enough set of tools to assess the budgetary choices that states are making. Now, I was very interested to hear what Busi Sibeko has said concerning the work of the Institute for Economic Justice in South Africa and the work of civil society in South Africa, thinking of challenging the recovery plan that was adopted in South Africa on the basis of the constitutional rights stipulated in the Constitution. But in general, I think that despite the excellent work of, for example, the Center for Economic and Social Rights with the Opera framework, or the guidelines that Aoife Nolan refers to that were proposed by the independent expert on foreign debt and economic, social and cultural rights, I think we still do not have from within the human rights community a solid enough tool or set of tools in order to challenge budgetary choices. And so the work of Savi Bisnath and others is extremely important in this regard. I think we must move the fight for human rights in this new terrain. And this is exactly what Kate was in fact alluding to. The second challenge, it seems to me, is to reconcile the short term with the long term. In the short term, the obsession of states is to avoid basically the economy from falling and from crumbling. And they want to rescue corporations who may fall bankrupt and therefore lay off a large number of workers, which of course would add a social crisis to a very important economic crisis derived from the lockdowns imposed by the pandemic. And I think what the SDGs provide us is a long-term compass allowing us to measure the usefulness of the short-term measures that we take. And we must keep in mind this long-term objective, because otherwise our short-term responses will be misguided. In this spirit, I think we must avoid two things. One, and this was alluded to by Savi Bisnath again, is to have austerity policies adopted as a means to finance the recovery plans by taxing families, households, instead of taxing corporations, and by increasing VAT rates, for example, disproportionately affecting the poor. We must absolutely avoid the mistakes of 2009, 2010 in this regard. We must also avoid a brown recovery, one in which the carbon economy actors would be basically supported in order for them to be able to continue their business as usual. And it's very troubling that in an article published a month and a half ago in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, co-authored by Joe Stiglitz and Sir Nicholas Stern in particular, 300 recovery plans were examined, and 4% of those only were green plans. In other terms, plans that would contribute to climate mitigation. 4% were brown, in other terms, encouraging the fossil economy continuing, and 92% were neutral from the point of view of their impact on climate. So these are the two mistakes we must avoid: the austerity plans and the brown recovery. So what must we do? Well, I believe we should do two things. First, since lots of the money is going to companies to avoid them falling bankrupt, we must make access to finance, to state aids by companies conditional upon certain commitments that they take: due diligence in global supply chains, the transition to a post-carbon economy, and particularly fiscal loyalty, paying the taxes where they make the economic profits. And that is the first set of recommendations I would like to propose to the discussion. Secondly, yes, there is a silver lining in this crisis, as Kate Donald rightly emphasized. 168 countries at least have adopted strengthened social protection measures as a reaction to this crisis. And this is a huge opportunity to go beyond the short-term cash transfer mechanisms that have been extended or set up during this crisis, to make this into long-term standing rights-based social protection floors. In this regard, I think the challenges are not only to develop this social protection as a rights-based system, but also to ensure that informal workers and workers in precarious forms of employment, 2 billion workers in the world fall in these categories, are protected by these social protection floors, and that this is supported by international solidarity mechanisms. And my third challenge, or the third proposal I would like to make, is a response, in fact, to the question of Cynthia Matthew about the just transition. I believe it's possible to reconcile pro-climate and pro-poor policies in the recovery measures we adopt. This would rest on 4 pillars. First, to invest in labor-intensive types of climate mitigation measures. For example, in the retrofitting of buildings, in the development of the circular economy, or in agroecological measures. We can encourage a green economy that is also creating jobs for people with low qualifications, number one. Number two, we need to invest in public goods that can make goods, services affordable to people in poverty, for example, public transportation. Thirdly, we need to invest in measures that are financed by the wealthiest groups of the population and by corporations. In other terms, equitable financing should be at the heart of the economic recovery. Fourth and finally, we must do this involving people in poverty so that their concerns, their views are taken fully into account in designing these pro-climate, pro-poor recovery plans that we must now adopt. So I think these are the few challenges we meet. It's indeed extremely important to seize the opportunity, and I'm absolutely convinced, as we all are, that the human rights framework can provide this compass we need, and the Sustainable Development Goals point to the direction we must continue to pursue. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Olivier, for this identification of two main problems or two main traps that we should not fall in. Doing more austerity and a brown recovery, although again, as reality is, we see that some packages are already going in the wrong direction. So I think it was very useful that you put also these very concrete recommendations and measures, and that I think we will have more of this in your upcoming reports, I hope. But I think we had a very specific question to Busi and then one to Savi. So Busi, I don't know if you want to respond to the question by Mona on the possible role of corporations on the, influencing the recovery or the package by the government, and then I'll give the floor to Savi.
Absolutely. I just thought I would jump in and give a comment on the military, because one of the ways that lockdown in South Africa has been implemented is using military to kind of enforce these rules. And in fact, we see that military allocation has increased. And so I thought that idea there about the military is quite interesting, because in South Africa, we've seen that there's been gross violations and deaths at the hands of our military and police, which is, of course, disproportionately affects poor areas than other areas. But just to answer this question of role of corporations, I've always thought that the budget is really not for us. The budgets in South Africa are not really written for us. They are written for the markets, right? They are written to convince credit agencies and others and debtors, right, that South Africa is a fiscally disciplined country that they can trust, that they shouldn't downgrade to junk status. And I think by this design, in a way, you can argue that corporations' interests are already integrated into this design, right, of capitalism, of neoliberal capitalism, which is a particular type of capitalism. And I think I saw a question there with regards to the financial markets, to say that financial markets are really play a big role in how governments implement these budgets. But I want to say that I do believe that, obviously corporations are consulted. In South Africa, we've got platforms where civil society, corporations, labor, in fact, the National Economic Development and Labor Council puts together all these people. But there were various platforms in which numerous stakeholders were engaged. But of course, we have to consider the power dynamics, right? So most of the time, business and government tend to be on the same side and are very keenly interested in, for instance, things like reducing the cost of business. And of course, they're very concerned about debt. And we see that in South Africa, one of the big things has been that austerity is being deeply moralized in the public arena. Through this notion of South Africa having so much debt. And I don't think the question of, what is the cost of doing nothing has not been engaged with adequately. And continuously, I think when we engage with business in various platforms, you do see that business is very empathetic to this idea of debt, but that's because obviously businesses are thinking through a particular accounting understanding of the world. And even though we say austerity is going to implement, particularly women, children, as we've already said before, I don't think these are the real considerations for what business interests are, right? And so, yes, I think maybe it's not necessarily that business is the one that plays the key role, but it's to say that the system is already biased towards business by design. As we know, we live in a capitalistic, racist, and sexist society, and by design that really truly benefits business.
Thank you so much. So I will give the floor now to Savi, and then we'll end with maybe Ambassador Tressler, Your Excellency, if you want to give a last word. I'm sorry, there are more questions coming in. I just want to say at this point that we will obviously not be able to answer them all, but we take note of them, and we have normally your email addresses, etc. So if everyone is in agreement with that, I think if they are clearly enough targeted to some of the panelists, we may give the opportunity to answer them in a different way and follow up afterwards. So Savi, you have some minutes, I'm afraid, to give some comments or answers.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you, Olivier and Brucey, for your comments, and also Kate. I would like to engage with our special rapporteur, because what he has articulated well some of the challenges we experience at a very concrete level. And the issue of austerity, I believe, is really tied into the question that was posed to me on sovereign credit ratings, right? Because we are in a context that is unprecedented. It's unprecedented because the crisis, the economic crisis, as well as the health and human rights crisis, it's not only national, it's not even regional, it's global. So many countries, low and middle income countries in particular, are concerned about their credit ratings. But the example that I find very compelling is mainly around middle income countries who do have quite a favorable credit rating and risk quite a lot. Governments will think that they will risk quite a lot in terms of foreign direct investments and other things if they lose that credit rating. And here is where I think international solidarity becomes very important, and the role of the Secretary General and what he has been doing in order to promote issues of international solidarity. And the High Commissioner for Human Rights has been with him shoulder to shoulder on this. Because if this is a crisis that is affecting the majority of the world's countries and the majority of the world's people, clearly our policymakers must understand that we cannot do business as usual. And we must then think of those policies, procedures, institutions which promote the context in which we are today, which have created this. And looking at the sovereign credit ratings is something that we may need to examine quite closely, and its role in promoting austerity measures, which we've all agreed impacts on the progressive realization of rights in normal times, and will definitely impact the minimum core obligations in times of crisis. I think with that, I'll stop there because I'm aware of the time constraints. I'm sorry I haven't been able to answer all of the questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Savi. And as I said, it's really clear we won't be able to go into all of this, but we take note of them. And I, before I give then the closing remarks to Ambassador Tressler as he opened our event, I think we can say that the organizers are also committed to continue this discussion, not least through maybe other events in New York and in Geneva, or virtually anyway, where we will have, I hope, many of you again with us for further discussions. And with that,
well, thank you very much, Sandra, and especially thanks to the Franciscans and the Center for Economic and Social Rights for organizing this meeting. I just would say, and I would try to be more realistic and specific, the short-term goal now, and probably in our hemisphere in Chile and in our region until October, is to save lives. The fundamental that we should encourage our people, for example, to study that has been invested by the government now, has been to incentive the people to stay at home, to comply with the quarantine in order to save lives. The second, the long-term goal will start probably after we finish with the pandemic, is how we rebuild our economy. And obviously the goal will be more inclusive and as Oliver said, also more green. We should aim at that. But we must be very careful on the recipe we give, because it should be different in every case. We have rich countries that they don't have problem of getting money for investments. We have middle income, as you say, with more problems in order to get those investments that are going to be very short in the market, and poor countries that will need more help. And the idea is, and I always say it in my house and in my family, someone at the end will have to pay the bill. And we must be very careful on that, because I've heard some voices, let's not pay the foreign debt, but at the end, someone will have to pay it. So if we need to be more, work towards a world with more solidarity, we should coordinate more our response, aiming at our own realities, economic and social realities. And that implies sometimes to make choices, because we cannot fulfill all our goals at one moment. And we must be very careful how we do it. And in that sense is my concern about the 2030 goals. You know, are we going to be able to fulfill that at that time, now that probably we're losing a couple of years on that? So how we rebuild our economy, taking into account the 2030 goals. That's all, Sandra. Thank you very much for hearing me, and thank you to Oliver, Savi, Busi, and Kate.
Thank you, Excellency, for being with us, for giving these remarks, opening and closing, and really last word from my end again. Yeah, thank you to all our speakers, panelists, and to all people who were with us today. And again, I think that's already a start of a conversation, I have the feeling. And there were a lot of provoking thoughts and aspects in all of your interventions. So I really look forward to the next one. So with that, I am closing the meeting and wishing you a good evening, a good day, or a good morning, or depending on the place you are. So bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.